Hello, welcome to today's 501c Drop. I'm Leya Simmons and I'm the CEO and co-founder of BetterUnite. Welcome. I am really thrilled. I think I say this every week. I'm really thrilled about today's topic, but this one uniquely, I think we're talking about capital campaigns and some new research that's come out about capital campaigns. And I'm speaking with the Capital Campaign Pro himself, Steven Shattuck, and their new research about capital campaigns. And what I think happens is that a lot of smaller nonprofits tend to view capital campaigns as completely something that's out of their reach. And I think that today's episode might shift that narrative just a little bit. So as I said, today my guest is Steve Shattuck, as you can see right here. Hi, Steve.
Hey.
I'm sorry, I said Steve, and I know it's Steven. I don't know.
That's
why.
okay. I don't actually care.
Okay, good. Really easygoing guy here. So Steven is the Director of Engagement and Technology at Capital Campaign Pro. And if you don't know Capital Campaign Pro, they are doing some of the most rigorous practitioner-grounded research that's happening in the space right now. And Steven works directly with the data behind their annual State of Capital Campaigns benchmark report. And he's here today to walk us through everything, maybe not everything, but a whole lot of what the 2026 numbers say. So I'm going to stop my share. Steven, I'm really thrilled about all of this. I think it's just really fascinating. And I also, like I said, I just know that there's a complete, large section of our sector that thinks that capital campaigns are not something that they can pay attention to.
Yep, definitely. They're scary, and with good reason. People are nervous going into them. But one thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, that our research shows is, we've been doing this for like 4 years, and I keep waiting to hear all those horror stories from people filling out the survey, but it just hasn't happened. Most people, actually a vast majority of people, are very satisfied with their campaigns. So it's a good time to be capital campaigning out there, despite all the other troubles that the sector is facing.
There's a lot of headwinds, to say
yes.
Put it mildly. Okay, well, I vote we dive right in. Is that good with you, Steven?
Okay, let's do it.
Right. So for an executive director, a development director, anybody else, even maybe a board president who've never run a capital campaign, or they really haven't run one in a while, how would you describe the landscape right now? And then how, if you had to compare it to 10 years ago, 2016 or 2019, just pre-pandemic, how would they compare?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you nailed the headline, which is the headwinds, right? So I think there's kind of a mixed bag in the answer. One is that for as long as we've been researching this, and it's only been 3 or 4 years, not a really long time, but the data has been very, very consistent, upwards of a 95% sort of satisfaction rate with campaigns. And the average goal attainment has been over 100%. In all 3 or 4 years we've been recording it. So I sort of pair the research with my own sort of anecdotal experience working at the agency, which is it's a good time to be doing capital campaigns. And that may seem kind of self-serving, right? Coming from a person that is selling consulting services, but that's why we do the research, because we kind of want to back it up. And the research is, almost 700 organizations here in North America.
Wow.
Very few of our clients are represented in that data. So it is kind of a wide swath. I think that capital campaigns are somewhat insulated compared to other fundraising disciplines to a lot of the headwinds that nonprofits are facing. And that's not to say that if you're doing a capital campaign, there are no headwinds. There absolutely are. But, and what I'm about to say, I don't necessarily think is a good thing, but most capital campaigns rely on a small group of large donors. And the wealthy in this country are doing very well right now.
Yeah.
So it's common for people to maybe look at those headwinds and the economy and wealth inequality and all those very real issues that we are facing and think, gosh, maybe it's not a good time to do a capital campaign. But you mentioned the past 10 years, 20 years. that has kind of been the case. Capital campaigns and fundraising in general does tend to weather those, shocks to the system. You think of the .com crash, 2008, of course, 2020. Now there are things that belie the data, such that it's more dollars from a smaller group of people, but that does sort of point towards major gift fundraising and capital campaigns as being a good ROI activity. So I don't know how sustainable all that is for the sector, right? That's maybe a different conversation, but for now, I say that as an encouragement. If you have a capital need, if you've got a big vision, and critically, if you've got a group of core supporters with capacity, absolutely keep your foot on the gas. Don't decide for the donor. If you decide for the donor, you're not going to get anything. But if you ask, you may get a yes, you may get a no, but at least you have made the ask. So the data and then sort of the anecdotal experience, I think, is encouraging to people that are maybe thinking about a capital campaign.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So it's not helping us with our sector problem around mid and smaller and micro donors, right. But it's pointing to what is actually working, which are those larger donors. So then talk to me a little bit about the report itself.
Yeah.
How do you gather the data? Where and you just mentioned what'd you say, 700 organizations?
Yeah, almost 700. Yeah. Wow. Yep, 700 campaigns. And what's kind of fun now is, now that we're entering the third report, we're getting people updating their previous survey as they sort of move forward in phases. So they're sort of updating their story. We're actually also getting some people that recently finished a campaign and now are starting a new one, right? Because some organizations, you're kind of always in a capital campaign, right? You think of higher ed or maybe big healthcare. So that's been fun to see in the data set for as long as we've been doing it. But yeah, to answer your question, when I joined Capital Campaign Pro, one of the first questions I asked was, hey, I kind of want to, get more informed about capital campaigns and benchmarks and data. Who does the study? Where can I go to download it? And the founders were kind of like, I don't think there is one. So I said, well, let's do it, because we've got this community, and it's definitely a void that is out there. There really wasn't, and still isn't, any other kind of report on capital campaigns from sort of an empirical, scientific level. So that's what we did. So we basically just put out a survey, nothing too fancy, just saying, hey, if you're in a capital campaign, or you're thinking about one, or you recently finished one, could you answer, one of these 3 surveys and tell us how it went, and tell us why you did the campaign, and how you're sort of preparing for it. How is it going if you're in one? And then if you recently finished one, kind of what were the results? And we got, hundreds of responses in the first year. I think we went from maybe 300 orgs to 500 to now almost 700 in 3 years.
Wow.
All shapes and sizes, small shops, to your point. There was actually a lot of interesting kind of small shop data. I'll tease that for later, but and then we usually do that Q4 of the year, and I kind of spend
that too. That was
towards the end of the year. I'm crunching the numbers around the holidays, and then usually January, February we release the report, and people can go to capitalcampaignpro.com/research. It's free. If you download it, like, a salesperson won't call you. That's not why we do it. And there's a lot of good stuff in there that we probably won't have time to get to, because there's for those 3 levels or 3 cohorts and different questions for all those. But yeah, that's basically how and sort of why we've been doing it.
Well, so you've done it for 3 years now, and what are some of the surprises that you've seen come out? Maybe this year first, but are other times that you've been surprised by what the data revealed?
Yeah, we were sort of surprised by the satisfaction rate and the goal attainment rate.
Those were shocking to me too.
Yeah, over 100%. Maybe people set their goal too low, which sort of tracks with what I sort of experience and what we do with our clients. Very often, and I think most capital campaign consultants would probably agree with this, that we're sort of pushing people to vision bigger, right? Because if you're gonna go through the trouble, 2, 3, 5 years, all the work, let's test the highest goal. And if it comes back lower, that's fine. We can scale back. But, if you start lower, maybe you're leaving a little bit of money on the table. But so that was definitely surprising to us. There were some things in the study that, surprised us a little bit. One thing that comes to mind, Leah, is that when we started the study, we're kind of in the tail end of the pandemic, and a lot of organizations weren't staffing up and also weren't hiring consultants at maybe the rate we would have assumed. They were sort of, low 60th percentile on that metric. But since then, and then our most recent study, that has rebounded to close to 70. So there seems to be maybe a little bit of an opening up in terms of investing in the organization and the process in terms of staffing up, maybe getting a consultant to help. And, maybe that was a symptom of just, the very tough times that we were sort of going through in 21, 22, and that sort of trickling down to, maybe being a little tighter on the budget. But I think the biggest thing for us, it maybe wasn't a surprise, but more of like a sort of a myth that we busted, is that the annual fund is not something that has to be cannibalized in a campaign. I think one of the number one questions I get when I'm talking to someone that's thinking about a campaign is, what's going to happen to the annual fund? Is it just going to go down and we have to deal with it? Yeah. And previous to the data, we would say, no, in our work and anecdotally, we don't see that happen very often. But now we sort of have the data to back it up, which is that a vast majority of organizations see growth in the annual fund during and after the campaign. So capital campaigns are great for, achieving that big vision, but they also sort of serve as a launching pad for other operations in the organization. Annual fund, major gift fundraising in general, well after the campaign. So that was sort of something that was fun to see sector wide, whereas maybe we had thought before, like, that's a nice outgrowth of our work because we do a really good job as consultants. But it seems like most people see that, which is good. We don't mind seeing that.
Well, it's great. But I mean, what do you think accounts for that? Why is that?
I think that a couple things. There's I'm going to do some conjecture here, but there were some other questions that I think point to the answer to that. One question that we asked that doesn't seem connected, but I'm going to try to connect it to the annual fund, is we asked people, hey, what were some of the benefits to the organization besides dollars raised to doing the campaign? And the top responses all 3 years have been around, we think we're better at building major gift relationships, major donor relationships. We think we're better at asking for money in general. And we also have put in place systems at our organizations that didn't exist. So everything from like, we never had a gift acceptance policy. We never really had sort of a moves management process. We didn't have a bequest program before this, and there were tons of things that people could kind of write in to sort of elucidate what they meant by that. Investing in software, right, is a big one for sure. Upgrading their CRM, getting well screening. And so that benefits the campaign and was catalyzed by the campaign. But when the campaign ends, and really even before it ends, all those things are going to benefit the other operations of the nonprofit. And I think that sort of, I don't know if trickle down is the right word, but it impacts the annual fund, right? Sure. So that's one of my hypotheses. Another one is just simply the act of asking for money in a more professionalized, sort of personal way, I think benefits the annual fund. So one thing that we recommend when people are campaigning is, a lot of times a donor will be solicited for their campaign gift and then not solicited for the annual fund gift, right? Maybe there's some fear like, oh, we don't want to ask that person for too much. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that is totally not borne out in reality. In fact, it can be a little weird on the part of the donor to not be asked for both.
You have been asked for one, but like see it somewhere and not have been asked.
Right.
I totally see that. Yeah.
It's a little strange. And so I think that as we work through that, and all the best practices, even if someone doesn't work with a consultant, I think they would probably stumble over this strategy, to do both, to say, hey, Leah, we so appreciate your annual support. Like, you keep the lights on. We're so thankful for you. By the way, we have this big, bold vision. We have this urgent need. I'm not a great copywriter, but you can kind of see where I'm going. But like, appreciate them for the annual gifts and recognize it, because donors kind of like it when you can kind of illustrate to them what they've done in the past, right? And you're a CRM person, so I know I'm preaching to the choir, but and then tying that to the additional capital campaign need, and I think that sort of bolsters the annual fund sort of naturally. And I think the last thing is that capital campaigns are sort of an upgrading exercise, right? You've got people in your CRM that have been given $500 a year, $1,000 a year consistently, but maybe we do a little, well screening on them or prospect research, and we find, hey, they could be giving 5 or 6 figures. So we get that gift, and they don't always sort of slingshot back to that $500 to $1,000 gift, right? Once you sort of unlock, yeah, exactly. When you unlock that giving level, it's sort of the annual fund gift also tends to increase, even if just a little bit. So there's so many benefits to doing a campaign besides just hitting that 5 or 10 million or whatever you're trying to raise, that have very long tail effects on the nonprofit.
I love that. I would have never thought that, but it makes perfect sense. That honestly, just the practice of putting in best practices and then actually doing it over and over again is a real benefit. So then,
and without a campaign, there isn't like a reason.
How would you know to do that, right? Exactly. You don't stretch your limits in any way. Right. So then what do typically, and maybe there is no typical, but what do capital campaigns kind of broadly look like? What's a normal, typical size, dollar amount, length, duration? Yeah, you go.
Going back to my first comment about sort of the wealth inequality, this what I'm about to say is why I thought that. They tend to be pyramid shaped, right? Now, there are some campaigns that are square shaped, sombrero shaped. Most are pyramid shaped. And if you're not a pyramid shape, you're not doing anything wrong, right? And in some ways you could sort of argue that, you're a little more broad, which is good, right? And you're a little more protected. But, you can have a pyramid shape and be protected as long as you're sort of fostering those major gift relationships. But the answer to your question, Lee, is pyramid, the Pareto principle, right? This sort of idea that 80% of the funding comes from 20% of the funders. That is really closely aligned to the typical capital campaign. We ask people what percentage of your dollars raised came from the top 20 gifts. So it's not quite the Pareto principle definition, but that number was 72%. So 72% of their goal attainment came from the top 20 gifts. And there weren't a lot of variations that were either pulling that number up or down. There were some corner cases that were maybe a little flatter. And of course, there were some campaigns where maybe 70 or 80% of the goal attainment came from one gift, right, from that lead donor. Sure. But in general, you're trying to raise 5 million, you're probably going to have $1 million lead gift, 20%, and then maybe a couple 500s, and then 3 or 4 250s, and you can kind of see how that flattens out towards the bottom. But that's usually what they look like. And if you're listening to this and maybe you're in a campaign or you just finished one and you didn't look like that, that's okay. No judgment, no one's doing anything wrong there. But that sort of average does point to, perhaps the need to be fostering some closer relationships, as many close relationships as you can with those high capacity donors.
Major gift donors. So you described, or you said you've been surprised by that 100% goal attainment.
Yeah.
So what then, and you also said, well, maybe we're setting that bar a little bit low. Are there other components to what success could look like?
Yeah, there were some dots that we connected. One that comes to mind is doing a feasibility study. That was sort of a glaring one. A feasibility study is technically optional, which is one reason that I call it out, because it's something that some people skip, sometimes for good reasons, usually for bad reasons. But there were a lot of differences in sort of those qualitative or actually quantitative results of the study. So we asked people, did you do a study? And then I compared their answers to all the other questions. We also asked people how they did a study. Did you have a third party donor interviewer? Did you do it yourself? And there were some interesting differences there. But in general, I would tell people to skip a feasibility study at sort of at your own risk, because it is ostensibly, step one of the solicitation process. You're talking to potential lead donors, you're socializing your plans, you're kind of getting feedback. It's that old adage of ask for advice, get money, versus asking for money, get advice.
Yep.
It's the former, which is what's kind of fun about it. That was a big one. Staffing also didn't point to changes in success rate necessarily, but did point to the length of a campaign. Campaigns tended to drag on longer when there wasn't as much investment in staff, consultant, and also feasibility study was another area where things were kind of dragging out. Which sort of, makes sense to me. That kind of tracks with our experience as well, where, if you don't do a study, you don't test the goal, you may get to 5 million out of a $10 million goal and suddenly get stuck. And then you have to stay in the campaign longer to make up that delta. And then also just, plainly, many hands make light work, and you can work through, and we were talking about this before with our businesses, but more is more, right? So, it's an investment, and sometimes it can be a chicken and the egg, because you need to do a lot of work in the beginning of a campaign before any money starts to come in, which can be hard. But the data shows that it is sort of worth it to be taking the load off of your staff people, because it is a big lift to do a capital campaign, which is nothing earth shattering to the listeners, I'm sure, but just to reinforce that.
Do you all find that you have, do you see ever that so to use your earlier example, at that 5 million of a $10 million campaign, I'm stuck. Now I'm going to try and bring in a consultant and write this.
Oh, yeah.
You haven't a lot.
Yeah. That's not in the data, but that is definitely our anecdotal experience. And the hard thing is there's not a lot anyone can do at that point.
Oh, really? So if you're going to consider that, go in with it.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard to help those people at that point. Sometimes, you can always go back to those donors and say, hey, we're having trouble, or maybe the costs of the project have inflated. So it sometimes can be a stewardship opportunity for sure. But, from a staffing and consulting side, we're not wizards. I mean, we're smart people and we want to help, but we can't make $5 million materialize out of anywhere. It would have been better if we had tested 10 and it came back at 5, and it's like, okay, we can do 5. Here's what the project will look like at 5. And then maybe in 5 to 10 years we can go back and that is more likely to be successful, that second campaign, because of all the things we've talked about, where the organization grows and kind of levels up through the course of a successful campaign, regardless of the gift amount.
Right. They've got that practice under their belt. They've got the system
exactly.
in place. And, yeah. So for a smaller nonprofit that's, let's just call it under $1 million, under $2 million annual budget, and with limited staff as well.
Yep.
I mean, I know that a lot of them just would assume that, and I know that I did this when I was in those positions, just assuming that capital campaigns aren't for them. What does your data say? And then also, I mean, I like the anecdotal part as well. What do you feel about that quote unquote myth, or what would you advise any of those nonprofits?
Well, it is a myth. We can confirm that it's a myth, because we took all 700 responses, and I sorted them by their annual revenue size. Mm-hmm. And so there were hundreds and under a million, which was great to see. So there were enough for me to be like, okay, what's going on with these under a million folks? And that's how we define small shops. That's totally arbitrary. It's just kind of, you said it too, it's kind of a natural, breaking point there. Those folks were just as successful. Their success rates were upwards to 95, 96%.
Same exact.
Their goal attainments were also over 100%. What was different was how much they raised. So I think the average amount for the entire data set was like $8 or $9 million. But for those under a million orgs, their typical campaigns were like 2 or 3 million. And that's great. And so, our co-founder, Andrea, my colleague, what she was saying going into the report is there's probably not going to be much of a difference except where the commas are in their goal amount. And that really, I guess that was, the commas are the same, but that first number is a little smaller. So I say this to be, encouraging that small shops can do it. All you need is a big vision, which any organization can have. And actually, maybe even smaller shops are more suited for because they're maybe growing, right? And an existing base of support. And small shops can have that. So they can do it. They do it. And there were actually areas where small shops outperformed the rest of the cohort, which is something we don't hear very often. A couple of things come to mind there is the executive director and the board tended to be more engaged in fundraising before and during the campaign, which makes sense to me because if it's a small kind of scrappy org, and I would assume that ED is maybe a founder or someone at least who is very passionate about the mission, and the same with the board members. Not that can't be true in bigger orgs, but I think it's probably a little more, if not maybe even more likely for the smaller orgs. So that was great. So I think the bigger orgs can learn something from that. It also tended to be their first campaign, which is, I think what that says is that anyone can do a campaign, right? Especially if you hire help, whether it's staff or consultant or, just seek out, that knowledge and that help in whatever form it is. But anyone can do it. So with them being their first campaign, what we saw is they were putting systems in place for the first time rather than upgrading a CRM. They were maybe getting their first CRM or, maybe getting their first sort of well screening tool or whatever.
You could also say that after the campaign, they became an over $1 million organization and bumped
I'm
into
sure.
the bracket.
You absolutely are. If you're raising 2 or 3 million, which was the average, and you were barely knocking down the door of $1 million, you absolutely are for sure. And then if the annual fund grows, which 70-80% of the time it does, you're over that. So you can do it.
Highly encouraging. That's just
absolutely
information. Yeah,
absolutely. And with capital campaigns, consultants I think don't like us to say this, but we don't mind saying it because we're sort of we're the rogues of the sector. I feel like there is a playbook to capital campaigns that anyone can follow. There's not a lot of like black magic or anything super secret. And I think
you're officially not wizards, as you said.
No, and like if. Yeah, you can, and we're happy to like elucidate that playbook for people and empower them. But some consultants, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz a little bit, where it's like, we'll do it. We know how to do it. We've been doing it for decades, and only us can do it. And you can do it. It's one of the only it's one of the only fundraising disciplines where there is sort of a playbook that has sort of sequential steps. And sometimes there are variations, of course, but anyone can do it. And size. I do
have to imagine that some experience can really help. And like you said,
it is
coming in midway, midstream is often too late. So,
although one thing I have heard people say, Leah, on our team is that, and maybe this speaks to the small shop success, is when you don't have bad capital campaign habits, you're in even better shape. But that's maybe not everybody. But you're right. There are benefits to having kind of gone through it and kind of knowing, okay, we made this mistake last time. We know what to avoid this time. Yeah.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. So you spoke about this a minute ago, but I want to come back to it. The donor base. The size of the donor. So you said like all you have to have is the size of a donor. So what about an organization that's like, okay, I've got big vision, but we're still
Yeah.
pretty new, and I don't know that I have the donor base to
Yeah.
support the capital campaign. What is your guidance in that case?
It's fair. It's a good question. If you have no individual giving program, right? Some organizations are, fee for service or grant or maybe government funded, which is fine, right? It might be a little harder. You may have to spend maybe 6 months, a year or longer establishing an individual giving program, and then the question is there a major gift program? Are there people that are not necessarily giving a certain dollar amount, but are maybe giving a dollar amount that is significant to them, right? That is sort of if there are any prerequisites that maybe we would sort of put our foot down about, I think those are probably it. Although in a capital campaign, grant funding does come into play, foundation giving, grants, and federal funding, and of course fee for service can help keep the lights on. Those revenue sources definitely do come into play. But to one of your earlier questions of like, what do most capital campaigns look like? Most have a significant majority of the funds coming from individuals, and usually that little slice of the pie is a small group of people, right? It's a small group of individuals. It's not a huge crowd. So there's not necessarily like a number in the database that I think people have to shoot for. But one thing that may be helpful to hear is, are there people that have been giving to you consistently for many years in a row?
Okay.
Kind of throwing out gift amount just for a second, it doesn't really matter. Like, to me, it's more significant. And I'm a database person, so I love this. But like, if someone has been giving to you $100 a year for 5 years or more, and maybe also volunteers or also serves on a committee or is also a monthly donor, those signals are what where you start to separate. Okay, these are the people that we think might be major contributors to the campaign. But that 5-year donor at like $100 a year, I think is more significant than someone who gave $1,000 5 years or 10 years ago and hasn't given since, even if we know that person to maybe be like really wealthy or whatever. Start with the engagement. Do you have a close group of supporters? Yeah.
I love that. And so to that, when you are looking at that close group of supporters and maybe don't understand them fully, is it a prerequisite or something that you just highly advise to have wealth screening tools, a donor search or iWave or whatever that is working for you?
It's something that's kind of a good thing to have. I wouldn't say like if you don't have it or don't do it, you're toast before you even get started. But it's interesting to look at those long-term loyal donors and then sort of level set their giving compared to where they are giving other places, right? So if you see a big delta there, like, oh, they've been giving us $100 a year and they're engaged and they like us, but gosh, they're giving 50 grand a year to this other organization in town or elsewhere that kind of looks like us within the same cause type, that's when I think doing the wealth screening kind of shows ROI, because the result there is that you would bring that giving to other organizations to yours, and they're probably not giving at that amount because you've never asked. And without a capital campaign or even a major gift program, there hadn't been a reason to. So it's okay. No one needs to feel bad about that. But that sort of intelligence and also having a CRM to begin with, to be able to identify that person and then well screen them, then you start to
come together. Like
exactly right. And that's a nice thing about the system, right? And that to me is a more fruitful strategy than like, there are a bunch of rich people in our town. We've never talked to them. They've never shown an interest in our cause. Maybe they have through other organizations. That tends to not be as fruitful as sort of those hidden gems in the existing community. And that's what I meant earlier when I said upgrading. You're kind of upgrading those people.
And that's just great guidance, period, in our
general
ecosystem as well. So we started out talking about like back in 2016, and then we've mentioned the big dips in our economy.
Mm-hmm.
How much does timing influence or impact the efforts of a capital campaign? Like, and maybe we're not just talking about the economy, but there's also election cycles, and
Yeah.
maybe, we've just done, back-to-back events. So maybe for that one organization, there could be some donor fatigue. What's your
Yeah.
guidance around timing?
Well, I think that a couple things come to mind as we're recording this in mid 26. We haven't really kind of shaken the inflation that we've been experiencing for the last 4 or 5 years. So I say that because the longer people wait, the more expensive their project is going to be. Just period, right? And so if you are maybe observing the landscape and saying maybe now is not a good time, whether you're right or wrong, and you may be right depending on what you're seeing and feeling. If you do indeed pause, the campaign goal is going to have to be bigger when you unpause it in a year or 2 years. So that's a consideration for people.
The cost,
right?
The cost of
the cost
you're working to do is going to be
yeah,
higher,
the
sure.
cost of lumber and steels and nail and labor is going to be higher. And not every campaign has a building project. Some campaigns are purely programmatic or endowment, but most have a building campaign, is why I say that. So if that's not you, you can kind of gloss over what I just said, and that's fine. The other thing is, and we asked this question, Leah, in the first couple of surveys, did you pause for the pandemic? Did you pause because of inflation when it was really hot, right, in 2022 or 23? All the years are just blending together. But most people said no. I think it was to the tune of like 70 or 80% of people said, no, we did not pause. And that kind of made me feel good, because I feel like, there's never a good time to start, which means it's kind of always a good time to start, right? And again, that may seem a little self-serving coming from someone who wants people to do campaigns, but I do think there is data to back it up. It's going to get more expensive.
Yeah, and I'm surprised by that a little bit as well, just because in 22 and 23 was our last stock market dip. It didn't go down very much, but that does impact those
high value donors.
Yeah, so interesting.
For sure. And I think there is typically sometimes 3 to 12 months of work before you start soliciting gifts, to kind of get your case for support lined up and, define the project costs. So if someone were to start today, on June 2nd, 2026, it's probably going to be a few months before you're actually even soliciting donors. And sometimes people are maybe surprised by some of that work you need to do in the beginning. So that's maybe another reason to get started is there's just kind of a lot of homework to do, which is maybe not exciting. People kind of want to be excited and go ask for talk to donors about it, which is good. But usually that's a few months into the process, and there's a lot of work to be done there. So again, the longer you wait, you're just sort of, delaying the checks coming in.
It's always the boring stuff that moves the needle, isn't it?
I know. Well, in all facets of life.
I mean, that is so applicable to everything. Did you look at, and you keep being very kind and waving a flag when you're like, I know this is self-serving and so forth, but did you look in your data and your research at all at a comparison of those that hired a consultant, somebody like a capital campaign pro, versus those that didn't, and how they fared?
Yep. The results weren't as they weren't as drastic as maybe we wanted to, right? Yeah. But where there were the length of the campaign.
Oh,
and that's okay. But it's good to call it out. Like that was the big standout. And there are a lot of causation isn't or correlation isn't always causation, but that was just sort of an interesting thing that was very clear in the data. So I don't want to totally ignore it, because I think there probably was a little bit of a correlation there. But there's a lot of different types of help that people can get. So, one thing I want to do in the next survey is maybe kind of drill down into, okay, what kind of consultant, what did they do for how long, to just get a kind of a better answer to your question. But to answer it, it was the campaigns tended to drag on longer without sort of that expert guide along their side. Yeah.
So you also mentioned then the staff that if there were more staff, they did better and the campaigns were
Yeah.
shorter. What does the staff look like at a,
Yep.
I don't know if there's a typical version or maybe for a smaller organization and then also for
Yeah.
some larger ones?
It's interesting, going back to what we were talking about with the small orgs. It's usually an ED and a fundraising person,
Oh,
right? It's a development person, a large organization, maybe it's a head of advancement or a chief development officer, but even orgs above a million, 5, $10 million organizations, we're usually talking to an ED and a dedicated fundraising person. And
okay.
and there isn't always a clear correlation between the size of the org and the size of the staff, right? You can have a somewhat new organization that has those two people and they're raising $1 or $2 million a year versus a long-standing established organization that is, raising $5 or $10 million a year and still just those two people. So I think maybe just time and existence helps with that a little bit. But and I think that's one reason why the small shops were just as successful.
Oh yeah, probably.
It's not because they were outstaffed by the bigger orgs. I actually think that it's because they were closer to their donors just by nature of them being smaller and newer, and it also being their first campaign, them really kind of taking the steps to make sure that this is going to be successful. So yeah, that's usually what it is. So I guess to really answer your question is where we see additional staffing beyond those two people, really beyond the fundraising person, is to sort of offload the non-campaign tasks, right? Okay. Because if you're doing the campaign and doing a feasibility study and all these things, you need help with like the gala and and all and like getting the newsletter out every week or every month. That is where that's what we see the staff doing rather than bringing in a staff member to do the campaign, if that makes sense.
It does.
Because
so you and I as technologists, do you see a bump if they've got a database administrator or an IT specialist involved?
That I don't often see that role. And we actually, to be fair, we didn't granularly ask like what are all the roles.
Specific.
Yeah, but I would like to. I mean, I think that's actually a good idea because it would be interesting to see if that was a difference. But anecdotally, when I think of like our 80 or so clients that we're helping at any given time, and we serve organizations from $1 million to $100 million in terms of their campaign goal. It's usually just the ED and the head of fundraising, and maybe one other. It's great. Yeah, it's great. And I think that also speaks to like there's a playbook. Anyone can follow it. Anyone can do it as long as you've got that vision and that support. You don't need. You don't need to bring in a whole cavalcade of people necessarily. Because it usually comes down to 40 or 50 gifts, right? That make the difference. And that requires one-on-one attention, usually with the ED or whoever holds a relationship, and stewardship and time. Yeah.
So do you advise, and if you do, what level advise securing gifts before you officially launch?
Yeah. I love this question. So absolutely. So I think kind of the rule of thumb is, a 70 to 80% goal attainment before going public. Now the public versus private or quiet phase is a little bit of a misnomer because people are going to know about
you're out asking.
You're out asking. There might be construction happening, right? You can't hide a bunch of bulldozers or whatever, or moving vans. What we like to say to people is the campaign stays quiet. The project doesn't have to stay quiet. So what you really want to keep quiet is the goal number and the attainment. Like think of the thermometer. You don't want to put a thermometer out in front of your building that starts at 0%. You put the thermometer out when you've got it filled to 70 or 75. That's very motivating to people who haven't given, like, oh, wow, they're doing this big project and look how much support they already have. And they're almost there. my gift will make a difference, even if it's only $50, $100, $1,000, which I know is a lot of money to people, including me, but I don't mean to belittle those gifts, but you can see where, the public phase becomes, a lot of people kind of chipping in to get that thermometer from the top. But I think the other reason, which I feel like doesn't get talked about very often or not enough, is that if you go public before bringing in those very close supporters in on the project, you might alienate them.
Yeah,
right?
They might be upset.
Yeah, they might be upset. And I'm not saying cede total control over the campaign to that group of supporters. That's not what I'm saying. But again, that adage of ask for advice, get money, that's why you keep it quiet to the beginning until you've talked to those 50 or 100 people or whatever who are really going to get that thermometer mercury up close to 80%. But I've talked to people where they come to me and it's like, we broke ground and we want to start a campaign. Are we screwed? Did we do it wrong? I'm like, it's okay. We can work with that as long as you haven't, put on your website that you're at, $0 out of a $10 million goal. That's really kind of the killer. So it's not quite quiet. It's a little bit of a misnomer, kind of like feasibility is a little bit of a misnomer of a name. But really it's the goal attainment number that really needs to stay quiet most of all.
So in your 3 to 12 months of advance work, is that 3 to 12 months before soft tasks begin, or that those
can be? It can be. Usually that 3 to 12 months includes the feasibility study. Mm-hmm. And usually there isn't a formal ask in that process. Although sometimes if the conversation is going really well and it can turn into that, but it usually doesn't. You're just sort of socializing the idea and kind of getting a ballpark. So, you could say that that is sort of step 0 of the solicitation process, depending on how you want to define it. Sure. But I think you could be asking for money, by 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, 16 months of the process. It doesn't have to be this very far out thing.
Okay. All right. So if we've got somebody listening right now that's thinking about a campaign in the next, because we know we need some time, so 18 to 24 months, right? What are a couple of the benchmarks from this report that they need to be really focusing on? What are the your primary takeaways they need to pay attention to?
I think the fact that 72% of the goal attainment comes from the top 20 gifts. I think that really should illuminate to people that this is going to be probably a major gift effort. Now, sure. Some organizations, it's a little flatter, like we said, and that's fine. But I think they're the exception versus the rule. Mm-hmm. So I think the question is, if somebody's listening and they're pondering a $5 million campaign, the real sort of soul searching question is, do we have people in our community or in our orbit, wherever you want to say, that could give a 6 or 7 figure gift? And if the answer is yes, and you can compile a list of names, you're good. You can start. If the answer is not sure, okay, maybe we'll do a little work. Maybe we do a little more work in the database, like you said before. And if maybe we do that work and gosh, we're not sure those people are there, then I think the tension turns well, maybe we should spend some time, really establishing a major gift motion, and that can transition very smoothly and directly into the campaign work. It doesn't have to be that happens and then there's a stop and then the campaign starts. It can kind of,
get a pre-goal, then a goal.
Yeah, it flows into it. And since most campaigns start with a feasibility study, the rubber really meets the road. It's are there 40 people that we can talk to in a study? Are there 40 close supporters or people we want to be close supporters with capacity, but most importantly, affinity for what we do? And that is usually where there's sort of a fork in the road. Can we create, we call it a depth chart. Everyone calls it a depth chart, every consultant, but is that list of 40 or 50 names? That's sort of the soul searching question.
I love it. All right. So I kind of asked my usual last question second to last.
Okay.
What should you go do tomorrow? So I hear that one. I hear that answer. What about, because we've talked about headwinds and economic inequalities and all of the things,
Yeah.
what in this data actually, or frankly, you can take this much more broadly if you'd like to, Steven, what makes you feel optimistic about the nonprofit sector right now?
Oh, I think, it probably won't surprise people to hear, that the goal attainment was over 100%, and that the satisfaction rate was 75%. That's kind of a cop out answer. And I think the small shop thing is also a good sign.
Really good.
And then I also, I think one thing is that, people continue to take the survey. The data set grows every year. And I talked about this really early on, but it's really fun to see people who took the survey 3 years ago take it every year and update their numbers, and also the people who start a new campaign. That is really cool to see. So that, we talked a little bit about donor fatigue, people going right into the next campaign. And maybe they should have done it all together. I mean, I don't know the details of every single story, but that makes me feel good about the state of things for sure. And also the fact that there were outliers, that there were people that sort of bucked some of the common wisdom that I've been talking about, who, they had a lot of people giving, mid-level gifts to hit the campaign. That's good too.
That's really good. Yeah, that's great to know. And I was very encouraged by just that natural growth of a small organization running a capital campaign and then bumping themselves up into the next, I don't know, demographic group or group of our, I guess, economic grouping that we assign. Steven, thank you for doing this work.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. No, I love it. It's fascinating and really, truly encouraging. Not everything we talk about on the phone
I know
is, but I wanted to go ahead and put up your information. If you have questions for Steven at capitalcampaignpro.com. When we send out this recording, or if you're watching the recording, in the notes, we will link you to the report so you can see it with no strings attached, as Steven has promised. If you've got questions for me, I'm Leya, Leya, at BetterUnite.com. We are also, Steven, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but we are also a podcast. So some folks might be only hearing the audio. Again, take a look at show notes, and all of this information is in there.
That's good. I got a face for radio. That may be better.
No, that's not true. But I did have to so the first time I listened to myself on podcasts, I was like, wow, note to self, slow it down.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
Maybe get a little closer to the mic. And maybe be a little less animated in the beginning, because it's very jarring when I come in full force at the beginning of some of this. But if I did that today, because now I can't remember, apologies to you all if you've made it. And then let me promote my webinar next week on my webinar. I get to do this. It's your event is just the beginning. Turning moments into movements. Steven, you mentioned that I'm a CRM person. I am, but I would really call myself a moves management person. And that has married to my experience and BetterUnite's work with events. So we love talking about how you can take the momentum that you and the motion and all of the excitement that you have garnered and worked for and frankly paid for with your event and turn that into longer term relationships, much more stewarding. It really should just be the beginning. So I have an entire presentation on this. I actually just did it last week at the Virtuous Summit. So come join me next week, Tuesday, June 9th at 1:30 Central always. If you are looking at my screen, you can scan that QR code and register right away. And of course, if you have not yet seen BetterUnite, which we really did not talk about, but BetterUnite does have CRM, moves management, and wealth screening all in a single place, plus all of your event tools. There's my one promo. Your marketing, I hope you're happy with me. Please scan that QR code for a demo, or also email support@betterunite.com. Steven, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was super fun. And frankly,
anytime.
I did not expect some of those results.
Yeah, and the hour flew by. This was fun. Thanks for having me.
I love it. I know it really did. Thank you so much, Steven. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have an incredible day, and let's all go do some good.